the research that I've done and study and my own experience is realizing that the person is still there. Energy never dies. So to accept that the person is still in your life, it's like I made this realization that in our Jewish prayer, we say that God releases, and we have a choice. We can either, if we want our loved one, do we want our loved one to be a vegetable, to be in bed with the inability to function independently? Because most people want to be independent. They want to be able to move from one point to the other and to live their lives and be with their family and friends and enjoy life. So do we want that for that person to stay alive in that condition?
Is something standing between you and your happiness? It was for me. I had to face my depression and the constant negative self-talk. Therapy helped me realize I deserve to be happy. That's why this podcast is called I Choose Health, because I made the choice to heal and I want to share that with you. As a gift to you, we've partnered with BetterHelp as our sponsor to help you start your own healing journey. We all face moments when life feels overwhelming, whether it's stress, anxiety, or just feeling stuck. Talking to someone can make a real difference. And that's where our sponsor BetterHelp comes in. BetterHelp offers professional online therapy that's convenient, affordable, and entirely on your schedule. You can connect with a licensed therapist by video, phone, or even chat, whatever works best for you. Let our sponsor BetterHelp support you on your journey to better mental health. You can get 10% off your first month by going to betterhelp.com/I choose health. That's betterhelp.com/I choose health for 10% off your first month. Take the first step toward feeling better today.
As a teenager, I decided to live better, so I gave up the meat, eggs, and cheddar. At 20 and 30, I wanted more, so I strengthened my mind and my core. Living a life that is healthier and wealthier because I choose health.
All right, guys, welcome back to the I Choose Health podcast. I'm your host, Stefan. Now, I want to talk about a subject that is specifically very sensitive. Also for me this week, because I did lose an uncle this week on Monday, who is my father's younger brother. And I believe he's in his probably either mid to late 60s. So, he's not old by any means, still relatively young. Lost that uncle lost back in March. And that was a particular death that really affected our family deeply because, he was 30 years old, stage 4 kidney cancer, and, it's still baffling, right? Like we dealt with a lot of disease and death, but, when it happens to someone so young and so good, it's one of those things that when it comes to death, it just almost feels like there's no finality, right? It just feels like there just seems to be a lot of unanswered questions. And so I want to talk to someone today who in their line of work has dealt with the issue behind grief, right? And grief doesn't only have to do obviously with death. There's different things that people grieve as well. But I want to speak to someone who has done this work for some time, who's a rabbinical chaplain and as well as a LCSW, is very familiar with the issues surrounding grief. So I want to welcome to the show, and hopefully I said this correctly, Chaya Lerner. Chaya Lerner,
Yes.
welcome to the South podcast.
Thank you, Stefan. It's good to be here.
So Chaya, I want you to tell our audience, what got you into this line of work. Why going to counseling and especially in the areas, I mean, you cover a wide array of different topics and issues, but specifically also looking at the stuff behind grief and what really what drew you into this work.
It's a long story, but I guess I'll tell you that first of all, when I was in high school, I noticed that people would come to me with their problems. So I was like the person who was the therapist in the end school. And so I took a different path after I graduated from my bachelor's. I got graduated from Louisiana State with a psychology background, a bachelor's degree. And I went on to try to go into law, and that didn't work out well. So I guess circumstances and the universe kind of led me to being in this field. When I was in my 20s, as a gay person, many of my friends were were uh, gay men who contracted HIV. And I found myself having to deal with not just my clients because I was working for a local HIV AIDS clinic. So my clients were dying, my friends were dying. And so it just like, how do I felt like the floor was ripping out from under me. And just as I was trying to gain my balance, it got ripped out again over and over and over and over again. And so I just started exploring, what is it about death? What is the physical manifestations of death? What does the science say about death? And how do we deal with it emotionally? How do we deal with suddenly this person was very much a part of your life and then not there anymore? And so I started exploring that concept. And it just so happens that that's where God, the universe, has led me to dealing with grief and all its manifestations.
So I know that typically grief is categorized into, five different stages. Initially, the first being denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. When it comes to the denial stage, what have you found has been, the common reason behind denial? I'm not just looking at a denial in terms of like the early stages. I'm also looking at it where, it's been a year, it's been 2 years, it's been 3 years, and that person is still, probably stuck at that denial stage. And I've also heard that sometimes that you can kind of be stuck, that you can kind of experience all those stages kind of almost like simultaneously. So speak about it when, someone who is trying to deal with the loss of an individual or close one after such a long time.
So, what you're talking about is Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who was a death educator and determined that there were these 5 stages. And what people have found is, even as the end of her life, she determined that this was not a linear. It's not like you go from denial, bargaining, depression, and then anxiety and anger. It's like it's like a spiral. One minute you can be in denial, the next minute you're bargaining, the next minute you're angry, the next minute you're sad, and the next minute you're accepting. So it's a process of how do you reframe um this loss, because once you reframe it, that my experience has been, once you've been able to reframe it in a different way that's more accepting to you, you have to, and that we hold on to the story that this person has left us. And I know it sounds strange, but the research that I've done and study and my own experience is realizing that the person is still there. Energy never dies. So to accept that the person is still in your life, it's like I made this realization that in our Jewish prayer, we say that God the releases, and we have a choice. We can either, if we want our loved one, do we want our loved one to be a vegetable, to be in bed with the inability to function independently? Because most people want to be independent. They want to be able to move from one point to the other and to live their lives and be with their family and friends and enjoy life. So, do we want that for that person to stay alive in that condition? And sadly, death is very much part of our life. We have to, it's kind of like I always view this as in two ways. One is that we have a bird who is caught in a body in a cage, and death allows for that release of that bird to fly wherever it wants to and to be free and to function. And I also think of it in terms of a car, believe it or not, because this is body is going to give out. But as far as when they've done research to determine that whether we have souls, we do have souls. There's a change in the physical and manifestation of the person. So when they weigh someone before death, there's a certain amount. And then when they weigh them after death, that's less weight. So it's reframing to get beyond the denial is to reframe it as this is what I want from my loved one. I want them to be able to release and to be able to not be caged in a body that doesn't function any longer. So once you get to that denial and through all of that, it helps to have this acceptance. It goes beyond that. My experience with my family, the people who've died, is that they're always sending me messages that always astound me. So just because the body is no longer here, the soul still exists and still wants you as a loved one to function and thrive, not just to survive.
It's interesting because I remember back in the end of January 2020, when the beloved basketball player Kobe Bryant died. And I remember getting a call from my brother that Sunday morning. And he was like, hey, I heard that Kobe Bryant died. And it wasn't that I didn't believe him. I actually went into this like state of shock and refused to believe him, right? Because if you know anything about Kobe Bryant, he's seen to be the definition of toughness, like not just physical
Mhm.
toughness, but mental toughness. So,
Mhm.
it was just like, no, there's no way that this happened. And then I remember telling my brother, like, hey, like, I can't talk about this right now. And I just hung up, right? That was my reaction to that. And to this day, I'm still wondering why my reaction was like that, 6 years later, to someone that I never met, but I was very obviously familiar with their hard work and dedication and the type of person that they were. And so for me, I noticed I immediately went into that denial stage of denying and refusing to believe it. And then going into the acceptance phase, it was when I think I learned from that TMZ was reporting it. And I know that TMZ was based in Calabasas. And so when I found that out, I was like, man, it might be true, you know? And
Mhm.
so that was where I started to realize that like you can go very quickly through those stages. And so that was the impact for me. And so for those people who, finally get to that stage of acceptance, what is the groundwork that has to be done? Is it that they do they necessarily, and I know you said it's not linear, but do they necessarily have to go through that denial stage to then hit acceptance, or can they just accept it and then go on?
No, well, like if someone has, let's say, well, but before I go there, I wanted to address what you said about Kobe Bryant and realize that whether you know him or not, it's a shock. You 1 minute you're dealing with a healthy hero, and the next minute they're gone. I'm like, wait, what? How did that happen? So it's like I had referenced before. It's like the floor has been ripped out from under you, and you've got to like, okay, how do I live in a world without my hero or without the person I respect? And so, one of the stages that someone who had worked with Kubler Ross, his name is David Kessler, and he wrote that ultimately we need to find meaning, and that's the reframing of the story. that they're not necessarily gone. Their memory is still there. We have a saying in Judaism that may their memory be a blessing. So it's always that you look at that person as a blessing. So you look at that and you say, okay, he's a role model for future basketball players. And so, his memory, what he did in his lifetime is something that we can focus on. But in terms of what you were saying about acceptance, I think that if you have someone, let's say, for example, that your spouse has dementia. Dementia, sadly, is a long-term illness that just takes away the person inch by inch, moment by moment. And by the time you have this moment of grieving, it's still a shock when that person dies. But at the same time, you already know that this is what's going to be expected. It's not a shock when someone that you may be sad that they died, but it's not a shock that they died. So you're prepared for it. What may be just the death and then acceptance may have been something that had been predetermined before the death. You've already done the work to deal with the possibility that this person would pass or die.
When you were talking about, people who are experiencing dementia, one in particular, my dad deals with dementia. And so I didn't really grow up with my dad. He wasn't really a part of my life from pretty much from the ages of 2 to about 13. And to an extent with this dementia, I've noticed that dementia can kind of almost be like a death as well, right? It's like it's no longer that person that you know, and you might be trying to find that person again, right? So for me, I think I look for glimpses of my father before the development of his dementia, right? And
Mhm.
to some extent, I'm like, okay, how can I? And I think with dementia, it's kind of easy to tap into that because since with dementia, you can't really form new memories or it's difficult to form new memories. The old memories are still very much there; they're very fresh. Oh wow! Look, so here's a hilarious thing. Look who's calling right now. That's literally my dad is calling right now. You can't make this up. I'll call him back later. But
It's a spiritual synchronicity.
yeah. So that's so funny. But yeah, so there's an extent to which I've kind of mourned that person in the past, and so I'm trying to deal with the here and now, and how can we make the best of who we have now, right? Yes, he's dealing
Mhm.
with dementia. Yes, he has different health conditions. How do we cope and deal with the person that we have now? So as you're talking about dementia, also speak to the different tools that we can implement to, cherish and value our loved ones that we have right now, even though they may have experienced something like a loss of memory or a loss of just like drive to kind of like continue. But sometimes that's another death as well, where you can have someone who just that drive to just like live and to just enjoy life is kind of gone.
So I was reminded by my teacher, Rabbi Zalman Schechter Shalomi, that dementia is a form of mindfulness, of staying in the present moment, because they don't remember. They might remember what happened to them in 1973, but they're not going to remember what they ate for breakfast that day or the day before. So it's a practice of staying present with them. And sensory, you just be there with them sensory because, whether it's watching a basketball game or a baseball game or eating a good steak or whatever you're eating. One of the things that helps with dementia is music. A researcher found that he had loaded up this was when they had iPods. He loaded up songs on iPods and went to nursing homes where people had memory cognitive issues, and sometimes they were in a comatose state. And he put this music on, and somehow they were able to remember things. It created these neural pathways that, so definitely, I know it sounds strange, but to listen to music helps the dementia. Um, but staying present, being there with them, as long as you can, but sensory, touch, hearing, taste, eyes, all that stuff brings them to and you into the present moment. We don't like being in the present moment. We try to escape. So what we need to do is they're teaching us to be mindful and in this moment.
So I realized that I had incorrectly labeled acceptance as the second state of grief, but I realized it was anger, all right, denial, anger, as the second state of grief. And so, I've witnessed people who, have to deal with the loss of a loved one, especially a loved one who may have committed suicide, right? And especially if your family grew up in that family grew up in a religious paradigm where I know I've heard everything when it comes to suicide, like, oh, that person's going to hell, or that person, they were selfish, they took their life, they were dumb. Like, I've heard a lot of negative things surrounding people who've taken their life. And, I think it's unfair, to say that someone is, whatever you want to say, selfish, stupid, evil, whatever it is, to take their life, rather than trying to come to a place of understanding, right, as to what happened here, what can I do to avoid this happening to other loved ones in my life. So speak about that anger stage where, people go into that grief and they're angry with the loved one who may have taken their life or may have put themselves in a situation where their life was taken, right? Whether that is getting into an argument with someone with a weapon or something to that extent. To speak about, anger and that's particular state and how to adequately address that loss, you know, when you're going through that stage.
All right, I'll explain that with a story of my own. Many years ago, I had a very dear friend uh who we used to go camping with. His partner and us would go camping usually around Labor Day, which is around my birthday. One day he said, "I'm not going to live very long." Now, this was my early stages of social work. So I when he lost control, apparently his mother had died. I'm sorry, his mother had gotten married to someone who sexually abused him as a child, and so he was very angry and very upset that she married him, and lost control and decided to play Russian roulette with a gun. And sadly committed suicide. He died. And for a long time, I blamed myself. I took responsibility because as a social worker, I, I should have done something and should have, called for help, removed the knives and the guns and all that stuff. And I came to realize that number one, when he made that decision to point the gun at his head, he made that on his own because he wasn't the person that I wanted, that I was friends with. I believe that we have different parts in our personality. And I believe that this part of him was a damaged child, a damaged boy. And that got triggered. And he no longer had the control to say, I need to call for help. He was long gone. So that part of him that was a responsible adult was gone, and he took his own life. So I had to reframe this and say, there was nothing that I could have done to prevent this. Yes, I could have gotten him help. I could have done this. I could have done that. But he wasn't going to listen. He wasn't able to hear if I would have said to him, you need to go see a therapist or come talk to me, do whatever to save his life. A few years ago, a very dear friend, her husband took a dive off of their 11th floor, their 18th floor apartment building. And for a long time, he was looking for help and couldn't find it. And I was upset because if they had contacted me before this, then I would have been able to get them the help. He was already, that pain was so intense for him that he had to kill himself. A rational adult, because he had a very close family. He had a loving wife, loving daughters. He was so close to his daughter, his granddaughter. And so a rational adult would have said, no, I need to go find help. I need to find the skills to get the tools to help me get through this pain. But it was so intense that he had to, as well as my other friend, had to escape that pain and to reframe that in my own mind that there was really nothing that I could have done to prevent this. That helps lessen the anger and the resentment. I still have the residual, but it's really, he made that decision. He's not going to hell. He's not committing a sin, though in the Jewish religion, if you say you committed suicide, then yeah, that would be a problem. But there's nothing that I could do about it except be there for the survivors, the people who loved him and do my best. And that's how I see myself as a therapist and chaplain, is that I am providing those skills so that maybe it might prevent someone from not committing suicide.
Would you say, 'cause I imagine that in your line of work, you're super and hyper aware of the language that people around you use or the actions of people around you. But would you say that those specific experiences, especially when you lost those loved ones, that made you hyper aware of the things they were saying, the things they were doing? Did you say that it created that hyper awareness within you?
Yes. But you're in denial. If a good friend is saying to you, I'm not going to live past a certain age, it's like, maybe now I might, after being in this business for almost 40 years, I might say, you need to get some help. Here's the help that legally, if someone is going to engage in suicidal ideations, then I have the legal authority to sign Baker Act, what we call the Baker Act here in Florida, where somebody is put on a 48 to 72-hour hold. But people tell me that they're suicidal all the time. And I tell them that, hold on, because it's going to get better. Nothing stays the same. We don't live in a bubble. So, your situation will change. You just have to hold on and be patient and hold on to something, maybe the love of your family or your friends. And then you can, that those feelings of wanting to kill yourself will dissipate.
And I'm going to get a little bit more vulnerable here because I've shared on the podcast, my specific struggles with ideation in the past. But then also, even though I say the past, it still very much is sometimes a present thing, right? Like, you get into difficult situations, life becomes seemingly a little bit too much. And so sometimes my mind kind of goes back to that idea of like, well, maybe this is the scenario that is going to probably lead me there. And I'll say one thing that has been helpful. So after I came home and I was interacting with my daughter from daycare, um, she said, "I love my daddy," and that I told her I love you too, and that just put like a different battery in my back, right? Where it was just like, okay, here's somebody that not only means the world to me, but it seems like I mean the world to them too.
Uh-huh.
And I wanna dive more into that, right? Because I feel my most alive. I feel my happiest when I'm around my daughter, right? Like I always tell people like I was at a Christmas party 2 years ago, and I left early, and so they were like, "Why are you leaving early?" I'm like, "That's well, one, my daughter is way more fun than you guys, so I'm going home." But yeah, it's when it comes to suicide, it is true where a lot of times you do think about it a lot, right? And I found myself in those spaces where, like, I'm thinking about whatever difficult situation is. I can find myself in a headspace for a very long time. But then it's like those occasional glimpses of hope, those occasional glimpses of something better that kind of keeps you going. And I've always been in that place where it's always been something that's kind of kept me from doing, right? So what is your advice, especially from a counselor perspective, to those who are maybe, considering suicide, but they're still holding on? What are you telling them to do to make sure that they're still trying to hold on and still stay here, make the best out of the situation?
So I've been studying something called internal family systems, and it's a theory that actually it's just a repackaged of typical psychological stuff, but it's believing that we all have parts and that there is an inner child in each of us, whether it's an inner child, an inner teenager, an inner younger adult. And just as you would not want to hurt your child, we need to treat ourselves, our inner child, the same way we would treat our children or our pets. So it's funny because, it's not really funny. It's just strange and a sad commentary on our life that when I ask clients, well, how would you treat a child? They don't have any clue. But if I say to them, how would you treat a Labrador retriever puppy? Oh, yeah, well, I would hug that puppy and tell them that they're a beautiful puppy and hug them and tell them that you love them. And so when we think about how we want to unalive ourselves, how we want to kill ourselves, it's really about how do we want to get out of that pain? How do we want to the life is overwhelming. It's sad. It's, too much going on in this world that just is heavy. And yet, if our child comes to us and says, Daddy, I'm hurting, or Mommy, I'm hurting, we will put them on our lap and hug them and, and, and comfort them. And that's really what we need to do. We need to comfort ourselves, self care. And what I find is, I liken this as if you walk into a dark room, you can either just stumble around in that dark room or you can turn on the light. And the light to me is gratitude. If we say to ourselves, this is what I'm grateful for, that my daughter told me, I love you, Daddy. That is something you feel in your heart and your soul. That's what you're grateful for. Grateful for your spouse, your job, your friends, your family, and it's like what we do tend to do with gratitude is we say, okay, well, I'm grateful for my house, I'm grateful for my family, I'm grateful for food. But if we were to say to ourselves, okay, I got up this morning, I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful that my daughter put on, a beautiful outfit and gave me a hug. And my wife cooked me a beautiful dinner or made breakfast for me, gave me coffee. Those are things that when we focus on that, on the positive, then the negative tends to be pushed out and lessen, and that light comes on in ourselves. But we tend to focus on the negative.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I wonder if it's more so a symptom of our world, right? Because we've grown up being told that the world is a terrible place, right? And I think a lot of times we go into the world thinking that. And I think it's more sort of survival thing, where it's like, okay, the world's a terrible place. You got to be on your P's and Q's, and you have to be aware of what's going on around you. And so I think that is, to some extent, I know for me as a New Yorker, they call us the jaded New Yorker or the cynical New Yorker. We're always kind of looking for the next thing. But I do think that you're right. That I do think there's a benefit to walking around with a spirit of gratitude, an attitude of gratitude, where you're thankful for what it is, and it's not a state of being where you are, ignorant of what's going on. It's just that you kind of hold those things in a balance. Like, hey, I know that there are terrible things going on, but I'm going to choose to also, use a positive framework for how I'm experiencing the reality of what's going on. Um, and so when we talk, because I know you also deal with trauma, how does that, when using that gratitude framework, how does that work with clients who've specifically experienced a lot of trauma, whether that's been from a friend, a loved one, right, or just like random acts of violence? How does that framework of gratitude work to bring them to a deeper place of healing?
So I'll tell you the story about New York City. So back in the 80s, I went to New York as a college student. This was my graduation gift. I was going to New York City. Everything was great. But there's a reputation that New York has of being mean, of being everybody for themselves, and, just a lot of negativity. A few years ago, this was right after, it was maybe 10 years after 9/11. I went to New York and found a totally different place. And I was actually very surprised because what I found were people who were kind, who were compassionate, who were generous, who, if I needed help, all I did was that there were people who stopped and said, "Can I help you?" Um, I tripped and fell, and there were like 100 people around me helping me get up and making sure that I was okay. So that was how they dealt with trauma. It's like, okay, we had this awful thing happen called 9/11, but now we have to take the mask off and see that we're all human, and that when we reach out with compassion and generosity and kindness and love, that it makes us better people. Think of the trauma that kind of set me off in writing this book was the effect of the Surfside Chaplain Tower collapse. And what astounded me was, and it always astounds me, though it shouldn't, was so many people coming together to help their neighbors and help the community. The outreach was amazing. And so we tend to think, oh, how awful that these people lost their lives. And yes, it was awful and terrible. And we remember them and do things in their name to honor them. But we can't just revel in that blood and destruction. We have to learn the meaning of it and move on. And sadly, we've forgotten that. I think now we're starting to come back to that. I think with COVID, we kind of separated ourselves from each other, and we were living in isolation for so long that we cut off the attachments that we've had in the past. There were some people that we did continue having attachments with, and that continues, but I see that. It's like you go right into a destruction like COVID, and then you go into like a war, or you go into an economic disaster, and you kind of like forget all the death and destruction that just happened, the many people who died, and you go on with your life without really processing. We need to process the death and the trauma. And if not, then we end up in a situation like we are now, where people don't really care about each other. There are certain people who do, but we have the world the way it is now. I can't hear you, Stefan.
So
Okay, yeah,
I
now I can hear
remember,
you.
Yeah, I remember I was interviewing Richard Batista in September. Richard Batista is a friend of mine, but he's also a firefighter that survived 9/11 that day. And one thing he was commenting on New York about was that he remembers how the New Yorkers were really there for each other at that moment. And it just felt like everybody was concerned with each other's safety. And he said it stayed like that for a good period. And then I think after it seemed like the threat of terrorism kind of, dissipated, uh, New Yorkers kind of went back to that jaded perspective of kind of like keeping themselves separate from each other. Why is it that we, as I think as human beings, after we go through something that was pretty traumatic, and then we go through that societal experience of like growing closer because of the trauma, but then we kind of get into that comfort zone, and then we kind of step away from that thing that was meant to really bring us closer, right? Why does it seem like we instead of leaning into the positive, we kind of revert to what we know, which is not how that has not always been a positive way of dealing with things.
Because it's usually based on how we grew up. It's how our families responded to each other. It always goes back to childhood. It's like if you were raised by kind, compassionate people, then you're going to be kind and compassionate. If you're raised by people who traumatize you, then you're going to be responding to that. So, yes, we have our connected humanity, but then then we become mindless again and go back to what is less important, really. We go back to work, we go back to our families, we go back to, partying, whatever is we were doing in the past. Sometimes, like I said about New York, sometimes things change. That attitude of how can we show kindness comes back to the fore, especially during, unfortunately, a traumatic experience that I call 2x4 therapy, where, we need to be hit by a 2x4 in order for us to get back on track of what's going on. And I think that's where we are now. I think people are starting to realize that the way we've been the way in the last year or so, that it's not working and that we need to make the changes if we can. Sometimes it takes a process to get back to where we need to be. And, that's what God says in our text, our Jewish text is be kind to the orphans, stranger, and the widow. We've missed that point and we need to go back to it. We need to take care of the people who can't take care of themselves for whatever reason.
And I want to switch gears because I want to speak about your book, Total Trauma. And I want to go a little bit deeper on the premise of that book. And what are the key lessons and takeaways that we should glean from it? I know obviously it's your work. And so I know you want people to come away with their own understanding of it. But for you, what has been the key lesson or takeaway from that book?
Something profound, and I realized the nature of what's in the book is that someone said to me after I read that book, I picked up the paintbrush that I had put down years ago, and now she's doing an amazing artwork. It's healing what has hurt us in the past. Just being in the world, just being born is traumatic. Whether it's the little T trauma or big T trauma, that's what we deal with. And as I was studying these texts for years as a layperson and then as a clergy person, I came to realize that what our ancestors did so many years ago is the same thing that we're dealing with now. Whether it's gun violence or, putting our children at risk, alcoholism, drug addiction, sexual violence, sibling rivalry, everything is coming back to where we were before. And now we need to take those life lessons and put it towards what we can do to heal. that's the whole point of this book, is how do we heal our traumas to live better lives. One of the most profound things that, as I am a child and grandchild of Holocaust survivors, and what was so meaningful to me was that my book was at the Frankfurt Book Fair in October of last year, and people, Germans, were coming up to the publisher saying, "This book is meaningful." And to me, to be in this, to have my book in this country that pretty much it imploded my family and was part of the healing process, because that's the intention of the book, is like, how do I use what our ancestors, because I do mean this in a very general way, because our ancestors are your ancestors, and whether you're Christian, Buddhist, Muslim, Jewish, atheist, they're still our ancestors. And how did they deal with it? How did they deal with these issues of war, and I see it being played out constantly in the news. And this is why it was written in the text that a king needs to write his own Torah. And because the more you understand your wisdom, the better you're able to lead. How do we treat our the widow, the orphan, the stranger? We're playing that out now. The war between Israel and Lebanon and Iran, that is very much a Bronze Age situation.
So that's a difficult situation to talk about because, you know, since I've been living in America for 20 years now, and so I'm originally from Barbados, and I moved here when I was about 15, 16. So, been here for 20 years now, and the issue, of, this between Israel and Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, has always been a significant issue. And I've never felt more cautious than now, right? Where it's like, okay, I may have this perspective, but I don't know if I can share it or if I should share it, right? And it just seems like a very rare time. And I've always been told that if we want to heal and move past the situation, that we need to definitely talk about it. And obviously, there are a lot of groups and people who are open to talk about it. But then there's some people who are like, there's no questions here. Like, you don't need to talk about anything. We know who is the right person in this situation or right country in this situation. But I don't think it can be a thing where we stand and say, well, one side is better than the other, because at the end of the day, innocent people are still being slaughtered behind it. Now, innocent people being slaughtered in Israel, innocent people being slaughtered in Palestine. So we do need to get to a place, and again, not just innocent people, but like children as well. Like, I think this is something where we really need to put politics aside and put our ideas aside and think and kind of tap back into our humanity. Like we're losing children, but have done nothing. You know, yeah, you're you're 100% correct. And there's an amazing podcast. It's called Hidden Brain, and I kind of got into podcasting because of Hidden Brain. I started listening to Hidden Brain maybe 10 years ago, and they cover the issue between the Hatfields and the McCoys, and how they've been kind of back and forth with their revenge between the families. I just find it interesting because one thing I heard as you were talking about how Germany was responding to your work, and it says that Germany is one of the only countries that is ashamed of its past, right? Or one of the few countries that's ashamed of its past and its history, and has done its best to make reconciliation for what they've done. And so the conversation came up because I know in this country, Black people have been talking about reparations for a while for slavery. And it's just been very interesting to me that, everyone can get an apology, right? I remember when, Ronald Reagan famously apologized to Japan in 1988 for the bomb. And, you look back and say, well, our people were in slavery for a long time, and nobody's apologizing to us. And it seems like, is it a thing that we're a little bit lower on the totem pole, that we don't deserve an apology or we don't deserve some love and reconciliation? So it's just been, and again, I know this is getting into the politics of what's going on in America as well, but it's just been a, yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting as well because my experience when it comes to racism has been a bit different, right? I grew up in a country that is 92% Black, right? So then I moved to America now where I was not a minority. The interesting thing, and I know Martin Luther King said this before, where he said that the South was easier to handle because you expected it. The racism in the North was always so like colored, right? In between the lines, it was subtle, right? Because they wanted to pretend that they were there and supportive, but they really weren't. But there's been a really interesting perspective. And so sometimes I see shreds of certain things here in New York where I'm like, oh, that seemed a little bit racist, but I'm not sure. Like I had an experience a couple years ago. I think this is a news story for the podcast. My wife and I were in Savannah, Georgia, and so we sometimes what we do when we're in New York, we will order something on Target and then go and pick it up. Right? There's like a drive up order. So we order something to drive up at Target in Savannah, Georgia, and so we are driving there. We're on vacation, so we're driving there, and the directions seem to be off, and so we don't find the Target. So I saw this older white lady in a red car. She had to be in her 70s or 80s. So I told my wife, let's ask her. Seems like she's a local. She may know where it is. She may be familiar with it. So I drive over to her car and I'm like, hey, we're looking for the Target. We're trying to, pick up an item. And no joke and no words, she looks at me with an angry face, right? Turns with an angry face and then turns right, like looks straight ahead and drives off. And I was just like, I look at my wife like, was that racist? Yeah, I know. I wanted yeah, yeah. I wanted to dive a little bit more into your tour of trauma. I don't know if you have time to maybe do another call because I'm running out of time, but I definitely want to go a little bit deeper into your book because I definitely think it's a significant piece of work. I don't know if it will be too much to kind of liken it to Viktor Frankl's A Search for Meaning or Man's Search for Meaning, but I think it seems to have like a similar impact. Yeah. Well, Chaya, I really appreciate your time. I really appreciate your patience as well. I know the audience doesn't know what happened prior to setting this up, but I definitely appreciate you just being patient with me and doing this. And for my audience, this is just a reminder that, again, choosing health really is about choosing power, possibility, and purpose. All right.